I came to the Reclaiming Canada conference in part to be able to interview in person a number of people who I've only so far met via Zoom. But along the way, I met a pleasant surprise. John Rustad is the leader of the Conservative Party of BC, and in his keynote speech last night, he said many things that we all need to hear about how to reform politics, not just in BC, but across Canada. John, it's a pleasure.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me.
You have a very unique story because you've been in politics for a long time. You've been an MLA since 2005, but up until last year, you were with the Liberal Party.
I was,
Tell
yes.
us how it is that you're no longer with the Liberal Party.
Well, in the 18 years I was in the part of the Liberal Party, and actually 22 years because I was part of the party before I was elected. I had an opportunity to serve in cabinet as Minister for Aboriginal Relations and Reconciliation. I signed over 435 agreements with First Nations across the province of British Columbia. I also served a very short time as Minister for Forest Lands and Natural Resource Operations. And then after we lost government in 2017, we spent time as a critic for Forest Lands and Natural Resource Operations within the Liberal Party. So what ended up happening was there was a leadership race in 2020, or after the 2020 election, I should say, and I supported a candidate. His name is Ellis Ross, and he didn't win the leadership race, and Kevin Falcon came in and won the leadership race, and of course, I've not since changed the party name to the BC United Party. So over the course of time, particularly after, as we approached that 2021, I noticed something federally. There was a paper that was put out by the Federal Liberal Party called the Farm Emissions Reduction Strategy. And what that was about reducing the use of nitrogen-based fertilizer and reducing the emissions from cattle herds. 35% of the economic activity in my riding is agriculture. And so this would have, a very significant impact on my riding. So I asked our caucus, and I asked our leader at the time, I said, let's have a discussion about environment policy, particularly this paper. Okay, we'll put it on an agenda. Well, that was in April. Well, then it got pushed off to May, and then it got pushed off to June, and then it got pushed off to July, and then the meeting in July was canceled. And in the meantime, there was a need to have submissions in by September on this proposed paper. And so at that point, I thought, okay, what am I going to do? This obviously isn't going anywhere with the Liberal Party. So I did a retweet of a Patrick Moore tweet, and Patrick Moore has been a strong advocate, about the truth when it comes to climate issues. And it was just a retweet. It was on Sunday. I didn't think anything of it. Anyway, on Wednesday of that week, the NDP and the left started attacking me on it. And that's what they do, right? I mean, they try to find reasons to create a problem in the party that's opposed to them. I didn't think anything of it in terms of the attack, but all of a sudden I started getting phone calls from my colleagues from the whip's office and from the House Leader's office and from the Leader's office. Well, I was taking the day off because the next day was my birthday. And so I just thought, I'm not going to answer the phone, I'm just going to leave it. So that night I arranged a phone call with the leader of the Liberal Party at the time, Kevin Falcon, for the next day. And so we connected the next day, and he was angry, and I kind of get it, right? I mean, he was frustrated about the situation. And I explained, I said, look, I was elected to represent my riding. I was elected to support people in my riding. This is an issue that's going to impact my riding. And he said, no, I'm sorry. You have to parrot our party lines on climate. And I said, what party lines? We haven't had a discussion about the climate issues in years. And this is a new issue that's coming up. He said, no, you know what our party line is. We want to be, leaders in fighting climate change. And I said, but this is going to have an impact on my riding. He said, it doesn't matter. You have a choice. You either have to parrot our lines or you can't be part of a caucus. And at that point, I thought, you know what? And I said to Kevin Falcon, I said, I was elected to represent my riding. That is my number one priority. I have to do that. And he said, okay, fine, hung up on me. And half an hour later, I was kicked out of the party. So that was the path that sort of left me from the Liberal Party of British Columbia, who once again has been renamed now the BC United. So from there, I thought, okay, what am I going to do? I'd been in politics, 18 years. I just started my 19th year. And I thought, okay, I mean, I could leave politics. I don't need to be doing this. Should I retire? I can fight as an independent, which is good. You can get things done for your riding as an independent, but you can't impact provincial policy because, you're just one voice. So I started exploring options with other political parties. I looked at the idea of resurrecting the old Social Credit Party, which used to be the governing party in British Columbia for many decades. I looked at, a wide range of other parties, had some conversations, and ultimately it came down to looking at if I'm going to stay in politics, none of those parties really were an option. I got into politics back in 2000 because I didn't like what was going on in the province. I never thought of myself going into politics or being a politician. So this was kind of new to me, but I thought back in 2000, I was thinking about moving to Calgary, taking my business that I had and reworking it for the resource sector in Alberta. So my wife and I had a long talk, and ultimately what it came down to was, do I want to be driven out of the province that I love and I want to spend my time here simply because of politics? So it gave me a choice: do I live with it, or do I get involved and try to change it? And so after being kicked out of the Liberal Party now, 18 years later, 20 years later, I was faced with the same thing. Do I just leave politics and live with it, or do I try to change it? And so that's what led me to thinking, okay, I actually want to dedicate some time in British Columbia to trying to change the way politics works in this province. So I found that the Conservative Party of BC was the closest aligned to my thinking, and so that's why I decided to join the Conservative Party. The leader stepped down to make some room for me, and I put my name forward in the leadership race and became the leader of the Conservative Party at the end of March of 2023.
Wow. Okay, that's quite a ride. Now, before we cover some of your ideas about how to reform politics, obviously it's some very hot topics. Andre, you spent, as you said, a great deal of time in Aboriginal affairs. For those who don't know, it's the UN Declaration for the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and it's, in my opinion, an absolutely disastrous concept, and I think you share that idea. How should we be dealing with the Indigenous people in our country?
It's a very interesting question because most of the country has historic treaties. My opinion of them is those historic treaties are not going to stand the test of time. At some point, someone will, from the First Nations, will challenge it in court, and the treaty will be, the judge will likely say the nations were taken advantage of. The government has to go back to the table and rework those agreements or rework treaties. So that would mean the rest of the country now is going to be in a real mess. In British Columbia, we don't really have much in terms of historic treaties. So we have a lot of First Nations, 204 to be precise, across the province. Only a very few of them are actually in a treaty type of agreement. And so they're really governed by the Canadian Constitution, Section 35 of the Canadian Constitution, which is defining Aboriginal rights, which includes title. And so the courts have, when the Constitution came in, I guess I should say, it was defined, Section 35 was defined as this open vessel that the courts would fill. There was no definition of what, Aboriginal rights meant at the time. And so the courts over time have had a number of cases that have built, the need for consultation, defining what rights are in terms of hunting and fishing and traditional First Nations activities, and that when those activities are impacted, there's a need to accommodate for those impacts. And that might be small or large, depending on the size of the impact. And then along came this decision around title, which show that Indigenous, or First Nations have title. And title, it's not what we think of in terms of private land, but it could actually sit sort of underneath in terms of a higher level of rights, I guess you could say, for First Nations in terms of that land. So as a province, one of the reasons why we did all these agreements was as we were doing mines or as we were doing forestry activity or even the pipelines for LNG, these type of activities, they would have an impact on the land base, on First Nations rights and potentially title. And so we'd enter into these agreements to address, what the courts have told us to address in terms of those impacts, so that, First Nations had an opportunity to engage economically, and projects would be able to advance, and non-Indigenous people would be able to advance as well in terms of these activities. So it was more of a transactional type of approach, but it was really designed around one primary concept, which is to get First Nations engaged economically. There are so many social issues for First Nations, whether it's, suicides or whether it is, poverty issues, whatever the issues may be. the only way to be able to fix those problems is through an economic solution. And we've seen it time and time again. And with one of the agreements that we signed, it was a big agreement that we signed on a pipeline with one of the nations, the chief was actually in tears when he signed it. And I asked, I said, why? Why, what's the problem? What's the issue? And what it was he said, no, I'm very excited about this agreement. But last week, 5 youth attempted suicide. And tragically, 1 died. And he was in tears because he thought this will now create an opportunity for hope, an opportunity for the people to sort of see a future and to be able to plan. One of the nations that we did some agreements with was the Haida First Nation. At the time, they had 65% unemployment, and they had a great chief. That was Ellis Ross, the person I was supporting in the leadership race for the BC Liberal Party. And we entered into those agreements, but through those agreements and through his work on LNG, he took that nation from 65% unemployment to 15%. And the only reason why it wasn't lower is because those 15% weren't employable. And he's moved from all of those issues, all those social issues, to people buying cars, people buying houses, people going on holidays, people building their future, optimism. And so that's what reconciliation needs to be. And so when you think about, and this is a long way to get to UNDRIP, when you think about the approach of UNDRIP is just, it's more of a government to government sort of a relationship where money flows. It doesn't solve any problems. It doesn't solve the main issue, which is reconciliation.
Well, I have to think it's going to make it worse, because we were talking yesterday about Professor Francis Wilson's excellent book, Disrobing the Aboriginal Industry, which you haven't had a chance to read yet, but I recommend that you do, because the problem is we've spent billions of dollars in this country, supposedly to help the Aboriginals, but none of it gets to them.
Yes.
Because as Professor Wilson revealed, it's actually just a giant machine to filter money into the hands of industrials and politicians. It's not going to the people. It definitely never gets to them. And this UNDRIP concept is just going to make that worse.
Yes.
It's basically they're just constructing a sort of an official machine to put money into their pockets, and the Aboriginals aren't going to benefit from it.
Well, even worse, what UNDRIP actually is going to do is it's going to create friction between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people. The very reason for bringing UNDRIP is about reconciliation. It will do the opposite.
Yes, it will.
It will do the opposite. It will drive that wedge, and it creates friction, because now you can't do anything on the land base without having consensus with First Nations, with a band. And so if for whatever reason a band decides they don't want that to go ahead, it's not going to go ahead. And so people get frustrated in seeing this, whether it's a mine or whether it's something personal that they're trying to do. And so there's those friction points that are building. And sometimes you get First Nations saying no simply because they don't agree with another First Nation. And they don't want to support the other First Nation's potential for claim on a territory. And so they'll oppose it just because they don't want the other First Nation that might be supporting it to see it go ahead because of where that friction is. And so all those layers of politics just get heightened. And it doesn't do anything in terms of people on the ground. Right. And so my perspective, quite frankly, is I have never seen anywhere in the world a legislation that identifies a particular people, whether it's by race or whether it's by religion or whether it's by any other type of function, that has successfully bridged those differences, that has successfully led to positive outcomes. It always creates friction. It always creates problems. And inevitably, it's always gotten rid of. And so I see UNDRIP as being that same sort of path. It's as good intentioned, but it is not going to lead to the results that I think we need to see here in British Columbia.
Absolutely. Now, John, I want to change tracks, because you were for some time on the Standing Committee for Health in BC. So let's talk about Bill 36.
Sure. Bill 36, you have to set the stage for what British Columbia is in terms of healthcare. We've got, 1 out of 5 people don't have a family doctor. 1 million people in British Columbia don't have a family doctor. The wait times for services in British Columbia are some of the worst in the world, certainly in terms of the economic developed nations in the world. The number of beds that we have per capita is some of the worst in the world. The number of emergency, ICU, these types of things are some of the worst. We have some of the best trained. When you get in the system, you get some of the best outcomes. But the challenge is the system itself is just overwhelmed. We don't have enough nurses. We don't have enough doctors. And we also have one of the highest cost, if not the highest cost per capita healthcare systems anywhere in the world. And so when you look at these problems that we have and the money that's being thrown at it, we need to find a different solution. So this is the context of Bill 36 coming in. And part of the other problem is, of course, we have a tremendous number, it's estimated to be close to 7,000 healthcare workers, doctors, nurses, and others, who have either been fired or left the system because of the mandates that they forced them to have vaccines. And so you got a system that was crumbling. You've thrown on this layer of these mandates, driving people out of the system, and it's the patients that are suffering. There was a case last summer, I believe it was August, where Dr. Day was fighting the provincial government around being able to provide services from a private perspective. And the province actually argued, essentially they were arguing in court, that the system was more important than people's suffering. And the real tragedy is the judge agreed with the province. And so this is the context, and now you've got this Bill 36 that's come in, this Health Professions Act, which changes the way the health colleges govern. And so we originally had about 24, 25 health colleges, everything from naturopaths to doctors to nurses to et cetera in the healthcare system. That's now boiled down to about 15, and then this will now take it to just 6 colleges. So you might think, well, that's just administrative, it shouldn't be a big deal. But in the act, what it does is, in these colleges, if you're a doctor and there's an accusation that something has gone wrong, you've provided a service and somebody's disagreed with that service or it's led to a negative outcome. When somebody's reviewing that case, you want your peers to look at it, look at the situation and say, would I have done the similar thing given the circumstances? Because they've got the experience, they've got the training, the knowledge. Under these new colleges, that won't happen. You might be lucky if you have one doctor. And the province is actually looking at appointing lawyers to be able to manage how these colleges work and to make these decisions. But it's also very prescriptive. It actually puts in place up to 6 months in jail and $200,000 fines for a healthcare professional who doesn't follow the mandate of the province or the outline in terms of the level of services or the type of service to be offered.
As I was discussing with Dr. Marcus in my interview with him yesterday, that leads to a situation where a doctor cannot give full disclosure to their patient if they disagree with what the province is telling them.
You've got it. And particularly, this is an issue with mandates. So I was talking with a doctor actually out of California where they have similar type of situation in terms of mandates than here. And he gave me a situation, he told me a situation of a patient of his. That patient had a number of underlying health issues. And the patient came to the doctor and said, should I get vaccinated for COVID?